Elara did not cry. She stood in the center of her father's study, a room that had always smelled of paper, pine resin, and the faint metallic tang of his surveying tools, and watched her uncle close the ledger. The sound was soft, a leather-bound sigh that seemed to finalize not just a column of figures, but her entire life up to that point. Uncle Silas was not a cruel man by active design. He was simply a man for whom the world was a series of assets and liabilities. Her father, his brother, had been a liability. She, his daughter, was the final, untidy sum to be cleared from the books. "The debts were considerable, Elara," Silas said, his gaze fixed on the mahogany desk, avoiding her own. His hands, soft and unused to labor, tidied a stack of papers that was already perfectly neat. "The house, the workshop, everything has been sold to cover them. It was the only responsible thing to do." She said nothing. Her silence was a vacuum in the room, pulling at the edges of his composure. He finally looked at her, his expression one of weary impatience, as if she were a stubborn stain on an otherwise clean slate. He expected tears, pleading, some kind of feminine collapse. He had prepared a small, condescending speech for it. When none came, he was visibly flustered. He cleared his throat and pushed a thin envelope across the polished wood. "This is what remains. $300. A final settlement. I'm sure you'll be able to find a situation for yourself." The word situation hung in the air, clinical and dismissive. It was the word one used for a stray dog or a piece of misplaced luggage. Elara looked at the envelope but did not reach for it. Her eyes drifted past him, to the wall where her father's things had been. His adze and his framing chisels were gone. His drafting table, with its 1,000 tiny nicks and ink stains, was gone. All that was left was a single brass object hanging from a small nail, overlooked in its quiet humility. It was her father's compass. It was heavy, solid, and old, its glass face spiderwebbed with a single, fine crack. It was broken. For as long as she could remember, its needle had been frozen, pointing stubbornly west-northwest, regardless of how you held it. Her father had called it his truth-teller, a private joke between them. "It doesn't point north," he would say, tapping the glass. "It points home." She had learned everything from him. He was a surveyor and sometimes a shipwright, a man who believed the world could be understood and set right, with plumb lines, careful measurements, and the patient application of skill. He had taught her to read the grain of wood, to mix mortar that would last a century, to sight a level line across an uneven field. He had taught her that competence was a form of prayer, and that self-reliance was the only true fortress. He had built a fortress of love and competence around her, and now, with his passing, its walls had been breached and sold for scrap by men like Silas. She did not cry. She did not plead. She walked to the wall, her boots making no sound on the thick rug. She lifted the compass from its nail. The brass was cold and heavy in her palm, a familiar, solid weight. It was the only thing in the room that still felt like it belonged to her. She turned, walked to the desk, and picked up the envelope. Her fingers brushed against her uncle's. He flinched, as if from an electric shock. "I will," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it filled the space he had tried to empty. "I will find a situation for myself." She left the study, left the house she was born in, and did not look back. In a small satchel, she packed a change of clothes, a block of hard cheese, a loaf of bread, and the few tools she could claim as indisputably hers: a small dovetail saw, a set of auger bits, and a worn leather pouch containing her father's sharpening stones. The compass went into her coat pocket, its weight a constant, grounding presence against her hip. The $300 felt like an insult, a flimsy paper ghost of a life's work. But it was also a tool, and she would use it. She walked to the train station, the sounds of the familiar town already seeming distant and foreign. She bought a one-way ticket to the furthest point the line would carry her west, a place called Terminus. The name felt appropriate. It was the end of the line. From there, she would see. The journey was a blur of rumbling steel and rattling windows. The lush, familiar greens of her home gave way to rolling, arid hills, then to a vast, high desert of sagebrush and stone. The sky grew larger, the land more unforgiving. She was a solitary figure in a landscape that did not care for her grief. She ate her bread and cheese, rationing it carefully, and when she slept, it was with her hand on the satchel of tools beside her. Terminus was not a town. It was a place where the tracks simply stopped, swallowed by the immense, empty plain. A single dusty road led away from the platform. There was a general store, a livery, and a handful of weathered houses hunkered down against the ceaseless wind. It was a place people passed through, not a place they stayed. She spent a night in a small, clean room above the store, the silence of the desert a roaring in her ears after the constant motion of the train. The next morning, in the store, buying a small sack of flour and some dried beans, she overheard two old men talking by the pot-bellied stove. Their voices were dry as the dust on their boots. "County's looking to unload the old ghost depot," one said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. "Up at the junction. Figure they'll tear it down for the taxes owed." "Ain't nothing to tear down," the other rasped. "Wind and time already did the work. A pile of splinters and rust. Cursed, they say. Old man Vance died out there. Lost his mind from the loneliness." Ilara felt a flicker of something in her chest. Not hope, exactly. More like a resonance, a pull. A forgotten, lonely place at the end of another, even older line. She turned to the storekeeper, a woman with a face as weathered as the landscape and kind, assessing eyes. "The ghost depot," Ilara said. "Where is the county office that would have the deed?" The woman, whose name was Agnes, gave her a long, steady look. She saw the worn satchel, the good quality of Ilara's boots, the quiet exhaustion in her eyes. "That's no place for anyone, child. It's 20 miles north of here, where the old spur line used to run. Nothing there but wind and ghosts." "Still," Ilara said, "I would like to know." Agnes sighed and gave her the directions to the county seat, a day's ride away. Ilara thanked her, bought an old, sway-backed horse and a second-hand saddle with the last of her non-essential funds, and rode north. The landscape grew even starker. The road dwindled to a pair of ruts in the dry earth. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue. She felt utterly alone, a tiny speck of life in an ocean of rock and distance. The county office was in a slightly larger town, a single-room affair smelling of dry paper and stale coffee. The clerk was a young man with a slicked-back hair and a bored, condescending air. When Ilara stated her purpose, he laughed. "The old Terminus Junction depot? Lady, you don't want that." He leaned back in his chair, enjoying the novelty of it. "The roof's gone, the water tower's about to fall over, and the well is poisoned with alkali. We've been trying to sell it for salvage for 10 years. Nobody'll even pay for the lumber." "Is it for sale?" Ilara asked, her voice even. "For sale. We'd pay someone to haul it away," he snickered. He pulled a large, dusty ledger from a shelf. "Taxes and fees owed come to $197. You pay that, and the deed is yours. You can be queen of your very own pile of rotten wood." It was almost everything she had left. $197 for a pile of ruins, 20 miles from nowhere. It was an act of madness. It was a desperate gamble. Or perhaps it was the only logical step left to her. She thought of her father, who had built things to last, who believed in good bones beneath a weathered surface. "I'll take it," she said. The clerk's smirk widened. He drew up the papers with a theatrical flourish, as if participating in a grand joke. Ilara counted out the money. The crisp bills lay on the counter, a stark contrast to the dust and grime. He stamped the deed, slid it across to her, and leaned back, waiting for her to realize her folly. "Pleasure doing business with you, ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with irony. Elara folded the deed, placed it in her satchel, and walked out into the unforgiving sunlight, the owner of a cursed ruin. She had exactly $83, a tired horse, a handful of tools, and a broken compass to her name. She rode for another day, following a barely visible raised bed where the tracks had once been. The steel was long gone, scavenged decades ago, leaving only the ghosts of railroad ties in the packed earth. Then, cresting a low rise, she saw it, and it was worse than she had imagined. The clerk had not been exaggerating. The main depot building was a skeleton. A vast section of the roof had collapsed, leaving the waiting room open to the sky. The platform was a chaos of splintered planks and rusted nails. The water tower, a huge wooden cylinder on a lattice of thick beams, listed to one side at a terrifying angle. The wind, the only living thing for miles, moaned through the wreckage, a constant, lonely sound. A wave of cold, hard despair washed over her, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. She had traded the last of her father's legacy for this, for a grave. She slid from the horse's back, her legs unsteady. The sheer scale of the dereliction was overwhelming. Where would she even begin? What had she been thinking? The clerk's mocking face swam in her vision. She forced the feeling down. Despair was a luxury she could not afford. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, calm and practical. First, find your shelter. Then, make your plan. She tethered the horse, giving it the last of her water in her hat, and began a slow, methodical circuit of the property. The main building was hopeless, a death trap of hanging beams and rotten floors. But attached to its north side, she found what the clerk had failed to mention. It was a small, solid-looking office, built not of wood, but of thick granite blocks and sturdy brickwork. It had its own chimney and a heavy oak door that hung crookedly on one hinge. Its slate roof, though green with lichen, seemed mostly intact. This was the heart of the station. This was where the station master would have worked, kept his records, and lived. It was built to a different standard than the public-facing waiting room. It was built to endure. Hope, fragile but persistent, returned. This was manageable. This was a place to start. She forced the heavy door open. It groaned in protest, scraping a semicircle into a thick carpet of dust on the floor. Inside, the air was still and thick with the smell of decay, dry rot, and ancient soot. A single window, its glass long shattered, let in a shaft of pale afternoon light that illuminated a blizzard of dancing dust motes. There was a simple iron bed frame rusted into a corner, a collapsed desk, and a fireplace choked with debris from a bird's nest in the chimney. It was a wreck, but it was a wreck with 4 solid walls and a roof. It was a fortress in waiting. She spent the rest of the day clearing it out. She shoveled out the dust and debris, swept the stone floor, and dislodged the massive nest from the flue. It was filthy, exhausting work. As dusk fell, painting the desert in shades of bruised purple and soft orange, she had a clear, small space. She used her saw to cut planks from the least rotted part of the station platform and boarded up the broken window. She wrestled the heavy oak door back onto its hinges, securing it with a new peg carved from a piece of hardwood. It was crude, but it was secure. That night, she built a small fire in the hearth. The flue drew perfectly, pulling the smoke up into the vast, starry sky. The flames pushed back the deep, oppressive dark and the chill of the high desert night. She ate the last of her bread, watching the firelight dance on the rough stone walls. She was exhausted, aching, and utterly alone. But for the first time since her uncle had closed that ledger, she did not feel adrift. She had a place. It was a ruin, but it was her ruin. Over the next week, she fell into a rhythm of methodical labor. Each day was a battle against decay, fought with patience and her father's tools. She spent 2 days just clearing the collapsed debris from the main waiting room, salvaging every usable plank, every straight nail. She organized the wood into neat piles, timber for framing, planks for flooring, kindling for the fire. The work was the engine of her survival. It left no room for grief or fear. Progress was measured in tasks completed, a wall cleared, a floor swept, a pile of wood sorted. It was during the cleaning of the station master's office that she found it. She was on her knees, scraping away decades of grime and hardened dirt from the stone hearth, preparing to repoint the mortar. Her father had taught her to look for the anomaly, the one thing that was not like the others. The hearth was built of rough-hewn granite blocks, gray and speckled with mica. But at the very bottom, tucked into the corner where the hearth met the floor, was a single stone that was different. It was a darker, smoother block of soapstone, its edges more carefully dressed than the granite around it. The mortar joint was finer, almost invisible, and while the other stones were cold to the touch, this one seemed to hold a faint, residual warmth from the previous night's fire. Curiosity, sharp and clear, cut through her fatigue. She ran her fingers over it. It was perfectly flush, but there was a subtle difference in texture. She took out her pry bar and gently, carefully, worked the tip into the fine seam. There was a faint scraping sound, then a soft click. The stone did not crumble. It shifted inward. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She put the pry bar aside and pulled at the stone with her fingers. It moved, pivoting on a hidden pin. Behind it was not stone and earth, but a dark, square cavity. The air that wafted out was cool and dry, smelling of old paper and oiled metal. Reaching inside, her fingers brushed against a heavy, oilcloth-wrapped parcel. It was dense and solid. With trembling hands, she drew it out into the firelight. It was heavy, far heavier than it should be. She untied the waxed cord that bound it and unfolded the stiff, crackling cloth. For a moment she couldn't breathe. Piled in the center of the cloth was a mound of gold coins. Not paper money, but real, solid gold. Double eagles, mostly. Their surfaces gleaming with a soft, buttery luster in the flickering light. There must have been hundreds of them. A fortune. Enough to buy 100 ruined depots. Enough to build a city if she wanted. Beneath the coins was a book. It was a thick ledger, bound in dark leather, its cover embossed with the faded crest of the railroad line. She lifted it out. It was a station master's logbook. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat, precise, and economical. June 12, 1888. Elias Vance, station master. Arrived Terminus Junction. The company has seen fit to post me to the end of the world. My partner, Mr. Albright, has dissolved our shared assets and left me with the debts. The railroad is all I have left. This post is all I have left. They call it an exile. I will call it a sanctuary. Alara sat back on her heels, the heavy book in her lap, the gold forgotten beside her. She read on, page after page, completely engrossed. Elias Vance's story unfolded in the spare, practical prose of a man who did not waste words. He wrote of the betrayal that had cost him his fortune and his reputation. He wrote of his initial despair, the crushing loneliness of the vast, empty landscape. He described building the office with his own hands, quarrying the stone from a nearby rock slide, firing the bricks himself in a makeshift kiln. He wrote of the wind, the heat, the snow. He was a man like her father, a man who built things. He detailed his life at the depot. He was not just a station master. He was a geologist, a naturalist, a survivor. He documented the local flora and fauna, the patterns of the weather. And then, about a year into his entries, the tone shifted. October 4th, 1889. Followed the dry wash 2 miles into the hills today. Found an interesting quartz outcrop. It appears to be laced with something more, something yellow. Over the next several years, the logbook chronicled his secret. He had discovered a small but rich vein of gold. In his spare time, with simple tools, he mined it, hoarding the raw dust and nuggets. He wrote of his quiet satisfaction, not in the wealth itself, but in the reversal of his fortune through his own hard work and observation. He had been cast out with nothing, and he had made a fortune from the very earth of his exile. The final entry was dated 20 years after the first. The handwriting was slightly less steady, but just as clear. September 1st, 1908. The line is being decommissioned. The world has moved on. My time here is ending, and so, I suspect, is my time in this world. This gold is a burden I cannot take with me. It is the fruit of this land, this solitude. I leave it here, in the heart of the home I built. If you are reading this, it means you have seen past the ruin and found the good bones. It means you have the grit to make a life where others see only emptiness. The gold is yours. The depot is yours. Albright took my past, but he could not take my future. May this place give you a future, as it gave me a refuge. Build a good life. That is all the thanks I require. Tears streamed down Alara's face. They were not the hot tears of grief she had suppressed for so long, but tears of profound, aching gratitude. She was not alone. A ghost, a kindred spirit, had been waiting for her here for decades. A man betrayed, exiled, who had found his salvation not in bitterness, but in methodical work and quiet competence. He had left her not just a fortune, but a blessing, a purpose. She looked down at the compass in her pocket, which she had taken out without thinking. Its needle pointed, as it always did, west-northwest. She stood up and held it out. In the center of the small stone room, the needle quivered, then settled. It was pointing directly at the soapstone in the hearth. It was never broken. It was not a compass. It was a key. Her father's truth-teller. He must have found this place or heard the story on one of his surveying trips. He had calibrated the instrument, this single, strange inheritance, to point not to magnetic north, but to this exact spot. It was the most elaborate, most patient, most loving map ever created. He had left her not a paltry sum of money, but a path to a future he must have hoped she would never need, but had prepared for her just in case. The gold changed everything, and it changed nothing. The work remained. But now it was not a desperate scramble for survival, but a joyful act of restoration. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a steward. She was fulfilling the legacy of two men, the father who had given her the skills, and the stranger who had given her the means and the mission. The next week, she rode her horse back to the town where Agnes kept her store. She walked in, no longer looking like a desperate refugee, but like a woman with a purpose. She laid a list on the counter. It was long and specific. Lumber of the best quality, sacks of lime and sand, boxes of new glass panes, rolls of roofing tin, hinges, nails, screws. Agnes read the list, her eyebrows rising slightly. This is a big order, a very big order. Alara placed a single gold coin on the counter. I can pay for it. Agnes picked up the coin, weighed it in her palm, and looked at Alara. The assessing gaze was still there, but now it held a new level of respect. She saw the calluses on Alara's hands, the streak of soot on her cheek, the clear, determined light in her eyes. This was not a woman of idle whims. Agnes nodded slowly. I'll have to freight it in. It will take a week. I'll have my boy Tom bring it out with the wagon. While she waited, Alara returned to the depot and began the most critical task, the water tower. It leaned like a drunken giant, its foundations undermined by erosion. If it fell, it would destroy what was left of the main building. Using her father's lessons in engineering and leverage, she devised a plan. She dug new, deeper footings. She used salvaged timbers to create massive jacks and braces. It was slow, dangerous work. For 3 days, she worked with ropes, levers, and the steady, patient strength of her horse, inching the massive structure back toward vertical. She checked her progress constantly, with a plumb bob she made from a string and a heavy bolt. On the third day, as she was tightening a massive turnbuckle made from a length of rusted chain and a threaded rod, a rider approached. He was a broad, thick-shouldered man with a beard full of gray and hands stained black. He sat on his horse and watched her for a long time, his face unreadable. Alara ignored him and continued her work. Finally, he dismounted. "You'll pull the whole thing down on yourself if that anchor point gives way," he said. His voice was a low rumble. "The ground is solid there," Alara replied without looking at him. "I checked it." He walked over, inspected the complex system of ropes and levers she had constructed, and grunted. "You need a proper block and tackle, and that bracing needs to be triangulated." He wasn't criticizing, he was diagnosing. "I'm making do with what I have," she said. "I'm Jacob," he said, "the blacksmith. I have a forge in the valley 5 miles east. I have what you need." He paused. "My workshop roof needs patching. The last storm took half the shingles. You look like you know how to set a straight line." It was not an offer of charity. It was a proposal of trade, from one skilled worker to another. It was the highest form of respect he could offer. "Alara," she said, finally turning to face him. She wiped a hand on her dusty trousers and offered it. His grip was like iron. "I would appreciate the help." The next day, Jacob arrived with a heavy-duty block and tackle, and several lengths of thick new rope. Together they worked on the tower. He did not treat her like a woman, or a fool, or a damsel in distress. He treated her like a fellow builder. He pointed, she adjusted. She sighted the line, he drove the stakes. By the end of the day, the water tower stood straight and true on its new footings, a proud sentinel once more. The following week, she went to Jakob's forge and helped him re-roof his workshop. She laid the shingles in perfectly straight, overlapping lines, her hammer strokes even and efficient. Jakob watched her, nodding in silent approval. When they were done, he presented her with a set of custom-forged strap hinges and a latch for her office door, their surfaces bearing the beautiful, honest marks of the hammer. When Tom arrived with the wagon load of supplies from Agnes's store, he found a work site, not a ruin. He also brought a message. An old man named Samuel, a trapper who lived up in the hills, had heard about her. He sent word that the alkali in the depot well could be neutralized with a specific type of moss that grew by the northern springs. He had left a bundle of it for her with Agnes. A community was forming around her, not through social calls and pleasantries, but through a network of practical, mutual respect. Agnes provided the goods, Jacob the ironwork, Samuel the knowledge of the land. They were all solitary people, accustomed to self-reliance, and they recognized one of their own. They saw her competence, and they honored it. With new materials and newfound allies, the work accelerated. Alara became an artist of restoration. She reglazed the windows of the office, letting clean, clear light flood the space. She repointed the entire structure with fresh, strong mortar. She built shelves, a sturdy table, and repaired the desk. The office became a clean, warm, functional home. Then she turned her attention to the main building. It was a monumental task. She started with the roof, working with Jakob to design and build new trusses from the timber she'd ordered. They hoisted them into place with the block and tackle, a slow, careful dance of engineering. Once the frame was secure, she laid the new tin roof, nailing it down in overlapping sheets that gleamed in the sun. The day she drove the final nail, a sense of profound accomplishment washed over her. She had put a lid on the ruin. She had tamed the sky. Winter came, blanketing the high desert in a sea of white. The wind howled, but her small office was snug and warm. The restored depot, its roof now complete, stood as a massive bulwark against the storm. She spent the cold months working on the interior, replacing rotten floorboards, plastering walls, and building new benches for the waiting room, exactly as they would have been. She was not just repairing a building. She was honoring its history. She was bringing Elias Vance's sanctuary back to life. One day, in the dead of winter, the worst blizzard in a generation descended. The snow came down not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding curtain. The wind shrieked, piling drifts 10 feet high against the walls of the depot. Alara kept her fire roaring, grateful for the solid walls and the tight roof. She was reading Elias's logbook again when she saw it, a tiny, flickering light far out on the plain, appearing and disappearing in the swirling snow. A lantern. Someone was out there. Without a second thought, she pulled on her heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around her face, and lit her own storm lantern. She tied a rope to the handle of the depot door and the other end around her waist, a lifeline back to safety. Then she plunged into the storm. The cold was brutal, a physical blow that stole the breath from her lungs. The wind tore at her, trying to push her off her feet. She followed the memory of the light, shouting into the gale. After what felt like an eternity, a faint cry answered her. She found them huddled in the lee of their overturned wagon, a young family, homesteaders, their faces numb with cold, their children crying. Their horse stood nearby, shivering and coated in ice. "Come with me," she yelled over the wind. "There's shelter." She led them back, a slow, desperate procession, following her rope line through the blinding white. She brought them into the warmth of her office, stripping off their frozen coats and wrapping them in blankets. She made them hot, sweet tea on her stove. The waiting room, vast and drafty but now protected from the snow, became a stable for their horse. The depot, once a symbol of loneliness and decay, had become a refuge. It had saved them. Her work had saved them. The family stayed for 3 days, until the storm broke. When they left, the father, a man of few words, simply grasped her hand. "God bless you, ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We'd have frozen out there." News of the rescue traveled. When the spring thaw came, the mocking clerk from the county office was replaced by a new, more serious man, who came out to inspect the property for the tax rolls. He arrived expecting a ruin and found a perfectly restored, functioning homestead. He saw the straight roof, the solid tower, the neat fences, the garden she had started. He saw the depot, no longer a ghost, but alive and solid against the horizon. He simply stared, took off his hat, and made his assessment without a word of comment, his face a mask of disbelief. The joke was over. Years passed. Alara's garden flourished. She acquired a few chickens, then a milk cow. The depot was her home, a place of profound peace and quiet contentment. Jacob, Agnes, and Samuel became her family, a silent, supportive presence in her life. They would gather at the depot on long winter evenings, sharing a meal in the warm office, bound by their shared language of competence and mutual respect. One clear autumn evening, she stood on the platform, watching the sunset behind the distant hills. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and dry earth. The depot behind her was a solid, comforting presence. In one hand, she held the brass compass. In the other, she held a small, intricately carved wooden bird she had found in the back of Elias Vance's logbook. She had placed them together on the mantelpiece above the hearth, the legacy of her father next to the legacy of her predecessor. She had used a portion of the gold to fulfill Elias's one unspoken wish. Through careful inquiry, she had tracked down the descendants of his treacherous partner, Albright. They were not wealthy. The fortune had been squandered generations ago. She established an anonymous trust that provided for their education, a quiet righting of an old wrong. The rest of the gold remained where she had found it, a foundation of security she knew she would never truly need. Her real inheritance had not been the gold. It had been the skills her father had given her, the resilience he had taught her. It was the ability to look at a ruin and see the good bones, to face emptiness and build a sanctuary. The depot was more than a home. It was a monument to the quiet, powerful idea that the most valuable things in the world are not given, but built. She looked out at the vast, beautiful, and unforgiving land that she now called home. She was no longer an outcast, no longer adrift. She was a steward, a pillar, a quiet queen in a kingdom of her own making. The $197 she had paid to a mocking clerk had been the best money she had ever spent.